The cold was the first thing I truly felt in years. Not the damp chill of a prison cell or the indifferent draft of a barn, but a deep, bone-seeking cold that seemed alive, carried on Wyoming wind that scoured the hard-packed snow in the town square, whipping it into stinging clouds that bit at exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. They lined us up on the raw timber of the auction block, our bare feet turning purple against the wood that had been hastily erected in the center of Cheyenne's main square. We were numbers, not names. A line of shivering, exhausted women in thin cotton shifts that offered no defense against the brutal winter that had settled over the territory like a curse. My name was gone, carefully packed away, in a small, dark corner of my mind where I rarely ventured anymore. To remember, it was to remember the girl who owned it, and that girl was a ghost buried under months of degradation and despair. All that remained was number 17. I kept my gaze fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the Rocky Mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the pewter sky. They were sharp and unforgiving, but honest in their brutality. They didn't leer or whisper crude assessments. They didn't reek of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies like the restless crowd below a sea of dark wool coats and fur hats, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they examined us like livestock. The flash came unbidden, as it always did, when I let my guard down my mother's gentle hands, braiding my hair by the kitchen window of our small farmhouse. Golden sunlight streaming across our wooden table, where fresh bread cooled on wire racks. "Remember, Ara," she'd whispered during those final fever-bright days when the sickness had ravaged our family. "You are worth more than what others see. You carry our love inside you always." The memory struck like a physical blow, and I forced it back into its buried place, sealing it away, where it couldn't hurt me. When the auctioneer, a fleshy man with a face reddened by cold and drink his nose, a network of broken blood vessels began his patter. His voice cracked like ice on a frozen pond. He wore a tattered wool coat that had seen better decades and a hat that sat askew on his balding head, giving him the appearance of a carnival barker fallen on hard times. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, his words forming white clouds in the frigid air. "We have here a fine selection of workers, each guaranteed to provide years of faithful service to the right household." One by one, the women beside me were sold. Each transaction was conducted with the casual brutality of a livestock auction. A rancher with hands like shovels and a face carved from granite bought a young blonde girl for his kitchens, examining her teeth and the calluses on her palms before nodding his satisfaction. A saloon owner with a wet, crooked smile and gold teeth purchased 2 brunettes, his intentions clear in the way his eyes lingered on their bodies. Each transaction was a hammer blow to my soul, and I braced myself for my own turn at humiliation. "And now, number 17. The auctioneer bellowed, his voice echoing slightly in the frozen air. "A bit weathered, perhaps, but there's work in her yet. Knows her letters, I'm told, and can handle domestic duties. Who'll start the bidding?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, punctuated by a few dismissive chuckles. I was too thin, my eyes too empty, my spirit too obviously broken. I offered no promise of a soft nature or easy smile. I was a tool, and a worn one at that. The men in the crowd saw what months of captivity had done to me, the hollow cheeks, the haunted expression, the way I held myself as if expecting a blow. $20. A man near the front grunted, not even bothering to look at me directly, his attention focused on the bottom of his silver flask. He was well-dressed, but dissipated, the kind of man who bought women for purposes he wouldn't discuss in polite company. The auctioneer tried to work his magic, gesturing expansively and extolling virtues I didn't possess. But the crowd was cold and impatient, eager to conclude their business and return to warm saloons and hotels. Then, from the very back of the crowd, a different sound, not words, just movement. A man who had been standing perfectly still throughout the entire proceedings, a pillar of silence against the swirling snow, lifted a gloved hand with 2 fingers raised. He was tall, easily 6 feet or more, broad-shouldered even under a heavy sheepskin-lined coat that had clearly seen decades of hard use. The leather was cracked and worn smooth in places, patched here and there with careful stitching that spoke of a man who took care of his possessions. A wide-brimmed hat, stained dark with weather and age, was pulled low over his features, casting his face in deep shadow. He stood apart from the other bidders, his posture radiating a stillness that was somehow more intimidating than any swagger or bluster. Along his left temple, barely visible beneath the hat's brim, I glimpsed the edge of a jagged scar that disappeared into his hairline, and the kind of mark left by violence, purposeful and permanent. "I have 30. The auctioneer crowed, his eyes lighting up with the possibility of a real bidding war. $30 for number 17. The man with the flask snorted derisively, finally looking up from his drink. 30 for that bag of bones? Hell, he can have her. Not worth the trouble of feeding. But another voice cut through the cold air before the auctioneer could bang his gavel. I'll go 35. Might be good for mending traps and such. It was Finch, a trapper, with a greasy beard and cruel pale eyes that made my skin crawl. I'd noticed him earlier, the way he'd examined each woman with the calculating gaze of a predator. His clothes were filthy, stained with grease and animal blood, and he smelled of unwashed flesh and rancid fur even from a distance. The quiet man at the back didn't hesitate. Without any visible change in his stance or expression, he raised his fingers again, this time 3 of them. 40. Finch's face darkened, his thin lips pulling back in what might have been a snarl. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pristine snow, leaving an ugly stain. 50. He called out, his voice carrying a note of challenge. And I'll go as high as needed. I got uses for a woman like that. The crowd stirred with interest, now sensing the possibility of entertainment. Money was changing hands as men placed wagers on the outcome, treating our transaction like a sporting event. Without a word, without even seeming to consider the escalation, the stranger raised his hand again. 60. A murmur ran through the crowd. $60 was real money, more than many of them made in a month. Finch's eyes narrowed as he studied his opponent, taking in the man's obvious physical presence, the way he stood with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence. 70. Finch said. But there was less certainty in his voice now. The stranger didn't hesitate. 80. The bidding had become a duel, a test of wills conducted in silence and currency. I found myself holding my breath, terrified of being sold to Finch, but uncertain what fate awaited me with the mysterious stranger. Finch opened his mouth to bid again, then seemed to think better of it. He glanced around at the crowd, many of whom were now watching him with amusement, then at the imposing figure of his opponent. Finally, he spat again and waved his hand dismissively. $80 it is, the auctioneer declared triumphantly. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in back for $80. The gavel's crack was like a death knell finalizing my fate. My stomach clenched as I watched my new owner begin to move through the crowd. But unlike the other buyers who had immediately approached their purchases to inspect them more closely, he walked directly to the auctioneer's table. I watched as he pulled a worn leather pouch from inside his coat, the kind carried by men who dealt in cash rather than promises. His movements were economical, purposeful, as he counted out coins without attempting to negotiate or complain about the price. He paid in silver dollars, the coins ringing against each other with the sound of real money. Then those weathered leather boots were in front of me, and I braced myself for what came next. I'd learned to expect rough hands, crude examinations, immediate assertions of ownership and dominance. Instead, he knelt. The motion was so unexpected, it made me flinch violently. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he meant to strike me, or worse. But from his belt he drew a small, sharp knife with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. The blade gleamed in the pale winter light, obviously well-maintained and razor-sharp. For another terrifying moment, I thought he intended to use it on me, but instead, he reached for the coarse rope that bound my wrists. The hemp had rubbed my skin raw over the weeks of captivity, leaving angry red marks that burned in the cold air. With one clean upward slice, the fibers parted. The sudden freedom was shocking. My hands, numb and useless from restricted circulation, fell to my sides like dead weights. I couldn't feel my fingers, couldn't make them respond to my will. But the psychological impact was immediate. For the first time in months, I was not physically restrained. He rose to his full height with fluid grace. And for the first time, I caught a glimpse of his face in the narrow band of shadow beneath his hat brim. It was a hard face, all sharp angles, and weathered planes etched with lines that sun and wind and years had carved deep into bronze skin. His jaw was strong, clean-shaven, despite the frontier setting, and his mouth was set in a firm line that suggested he was not a man given to easy smiles or casual conversation. But it was his eyes that held me. They were pale gray, the color of winter sky before a storm, and they held an intelligence that was both piercing and somehow gentle. There was no heat in them, no triumph or possession, none of the emotions I'd learned to fear in men's eyes. Instead, there was something I couldn't immediately identify, a quality that seemed almost like respect. He looked at me, truly looked at me, not through me or around me, for a single long moment. In that brief span of time, I felt as though he was seeing not just my physical form, but something deeper, something that the months of captivity hadn't quite managed to destroy. Then he turned away, walking to his horse with the same economical movements he displayed throughout the transaction. His mount was a big, sturdy roan gelding that stood patiently, despite the cold and commotion, its breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. The horse's tack was well-maintained, but practical, built for function rather than display. Tied behind the roan was a second horse, a smaller chestnut mare that looked strong and sure-footed. From his saddle he untied a heavy wool blanket, military surplus by the look of it, dyed the dark blue that had faded to gray-blue with age and use. He shook it out and held it toward me, not stepping closer, not trying to wrap it around me himself. It wasn't kindness in the way soft people showed kindness, with gentle words and sympathetic expressions. It was something more fundamental, practical consideration for another human being's basic needs. "You are cold," the gesture said. "This will provide warmth. The choice of whether to accept it is yours." I hesitated, every muscle in my body locked in suspicion. Months of captivity had taught me that any gesture, no matter how apparently benevolent, came with a price. Men didn't give without expecting something in return, usually something that left me feeling smaller and more broken than before. But he simply stood there, patient as stone, holding the blanket without any sign of impatience or expectation. His gray eyes met mine steadily, and I saw something in them that I'd almost forgotten existed: simple human decency, offered without conditions or ulterior motives. Finally, my shivering hands reached out and took the blanket. The wool was coarse against my fingers, thick and substantial, and it smelled of horse and wood smoke and something else, pine needles perhaps, or sage. But the warmth that began seeping into my skin was the most profound comfort I'd known in an age. I wrapped it around my shoulders, pulling it close, feeling actual heat for the first time in weeks. He nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, then walked to his horse and swung himself into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He didn't look back, didn't issue commands or explanations. He simply sat there, reins loose in his hands, waiting. The message was clear. He was giving me another choice. I could run, though we both knew I wouldn't make it a mile in my current condition before the cold claimed me. Or I could follow him into whatever unknown fate awaited me. The decision was mine to make. I looked back at the town square at the auctioneer already calling forward the next lot of human merchandise at Finch, who was watching our exchange with undisguised malevolence, at the crowd of men who had gathered to buy and sell human beings as casually as they might purchase livestock. Then I looked at the stranger on his horse, at the second mount, waiting patiently behind him, at the vast expanse of snow-covered wilderness that stretched beyond the town's borders. I wrapped the heavy blanket more tightly around my shoulders and walked toward the mare. My feet were blocks of ice, numb and clumsy, but I barely felt them as I grasped the saddle horn with stiff fingers and pulled myself up onto the horse's back. The mare was well trained, standing perfectly still as I settled myself. And I had the impression that this was not the first time she'd carried someone in distress. That's how I followed him out of Cheyenne. A broken woman trailing a silent man into a world of white, leaving behind everything I'd ever known, for an uncertain future that couldn't possibly be worse than the past I was escaping. We rode for hours through landscape that seemed carved from pure silence. The snow stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional stand of leafless aspen or the dark vertical lines of pine and fir trees. The only sounds were the muffled plodding of our horses' hooves in the deep snow, and the wind's mournful sigh through skeletal branches that reached toward the leaden sky like supplicating arms. He never looked back, but he set a careful, measured pace that the tired mare could easily maintain. His own mount broke trail through the deeper drifts, making the journey easier for both me and my horse. It was a consideration I hadn't expected, another small kindness that cost him nothing but spoke to a character I was only beginning to glimpse. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a sky the color of old pewter, providing no warmth and precious little light. Cold settled deep into my bones, despite the blanket working its way through the thin cotton of my shift and the worn leather of the boots someone had given me before the auction. But I watched his straight, unyielding back and found strange comfort in his presence. He was a mystery, and in my world mysteries were almost always dangerous. Men who bought women at auctions usually had specific unpleasant purposes in mind. But he hadn't hurt me, hadn't even spoken to me beyond that single moment of eye contact. He had simply cut my bonds, given me warmth, and offered me a choice. It was so little, yet it was everything. As the weak afternoon light began to fail, turning the snow from white to the bruised purple of approaching night, he led us off what passed for the main trail and into a thick stand of towering pines. The trees provided some shelter from the wind, and I could smell the rich, resinous scent of their needles even through the cold. Nestled in a natural hollow, almost invisible until you were practically upon it, stood a small log cabin. It wasn't a home in any conventional sense. It was a fortress against the elements, built of thick, dark logs that had been chinked with clay and moss to keep out the wind. The roof was low-pitched and heavy with accumulated snow, designed to shed the weight of mountain winters. It had one door, solid and reinforced with iron bands, and a single small window that looked out toward the trail we just left. A stone chimney rose from one end of the structure, its surface blackened by years of use. No smoke emerged from it now, but the very presence of the chimney promised warmth and shelter from the brutal cold that was settling over the landscape like a living thing. He dismounted with the same economical movements he displayed throughout our journey, his boots crunching in the snow, as he led his horse toward what appeared to be a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin's north side. He didn't look at me or offer assistance, didn't seem to expect thanks or acknowledgement. He simply went about the business of caring for the animals with the methodical efficiency of a man following a well-established routine. I slid stiffly from the mare's back, my legs nearly buckling as my feet hit the ground. The muscles in my thighs and back screamed in protest. I hadn't ridden a horse in years, and my body was weak from months of poor food and worse treatment. Wind tore at my blanket as I stood there on unsteady legs, studying the dark rectangle of the cabin's doorway. He finished securing the horses and walked to the cabin's entrance, lifting a heavy wooden bar that had been fitted across the door. The security measures spoke of a man who had enemies, or at least expected trouble. He pushed the door open, then stepped aside, leaving the way clear. Another choice. I could stand here in the cold and eventually freeze to death, or I could enter his space, accept his shelter, and place myself completely at his mercy. The decision took less than a heartbeat. I took a breath that burned my lungs and stepped over the threshold. The interior was a single room, perhaps 12 feet by 15, that smelled of old smoke, pine sap, and dust. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, its opening large enough to provide significant heat for the small space. Firewood was stacked neatly beside it, split logs of various sizes, all cut to precise lengths, and arranged with the obsessive order of a man who understood that survival often depended on such details. There was a simple plank table flanked by 2 handmade chairs, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. A narrow bed was built into one wall, little more than a wooden frame with a straw mattress and a collection of blankets. Against the opposite wall stood a second cot, currently folded and leaning upright, clearly ready to be deployed when needed. The room contained the bare minimum necessary for survival and nothing more. There were no decorations, no personal touches, no photographs or mementos. A few shelves held basic supplies, canned goods, ammunition tools. Everything was clean and precisely organized, but it felt more like a military barracks than a home. Yet despite its Spartan nature, the cabin wasn't unkind. It was honest in its purpose, built for function rather than comfort, designed by someone who understood that in this harsh country, the difference between life and death often came down to preparation and attention to detail. He entered behind me, bringing a gust of frigid air, and closed the door, dropping the heavy bar back into place. The sound echoed in the small space with a note of finality that made my heart race. I was trapped now completely at his mercy in this isolated place, where no one would hear me scream. But instead of advancing on me or making demands, he moved with the same quiet efficiency he'd displayed outside. He lit a kerosene lamp on the table, the golden light pushing back the shadows and revealing details I hadn't noticed before. The cabin was indeed clean, almost obsessively so, but it had the feel of a place that was maintained rather than lived in. Without a word, he walked to the folded cot and opened it with a sharp snap of his wrists, positioning it on the opposite side of the room from his own bed. He unrolled a second wool blanket, clean but worn thin by age and use, and laid it on top of the simple mattress. The message was unmistakable. He was giving me my own space, defining clear territory within his domain. He was telling me without words that I wasn't expected to share his bed, that whatever his intentions, they didn't include immediate physical domination. I wasn't a guest, but I wasn't chattel either. I was something else, something I had no name for and no experience with. He knelt by the hearth and began building a fire, his back to me the entire time. His movements were sure and practiced as he arranged kindling and struck flint to steel, coaxing flames from tinder, with the skill of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The fire caught quickly, sending welcome warmth spreading through the room like a physical presence. Once the flames were established, he hung a blackened iron pot over them, filling it with snow from a wooden bucket that sat beside the door. From a canvas sack, he added chunks of dried meat and vegetables, venison, I thought, along with carrots and potatoes that had been stored for winter. The aroma that soon filled the cabin was rich and savory, the smell of real food prepared with care. It made my empty stomach cramp with fierce, painful hunger. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a proper meal, and the scent of cooking meat was almost overwhelming. He stirred the stew occasionally as it cooked, adding salt and herbs from small containers on the shelf. When it was ready, he ladled it into 2 tin bowls, set them on the table, and sat down in one of the chairs. He looked at me, then his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering lamplight, and gave a slight nod toward the empty chair. The gesture was economical like everything else about him, but it carried clear meaning. You are invited to eat. I moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt or attack without warning. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that acceptance would come with a price I wasn't prepared to pay. But hunger was a more immediate concern than fear, and the smell of food was making me lightheaded. I sat on the very edge of the chair, back straight, and muscles tense, ready to run if necessary. The bowl of hot stew sat before me, steam rising from its surface like incense. I waited, uncertain of the protocol here. Was I supposed to wait for him to eat first, ask permission, express gratitude? He seemed to understand my confusion. Without ceremony, he picked up his spoon and began to eat his movements, economical and unhurried. Permission granted. I fell on the stew like a starving animal, which I suppose I was. I hunched over my bowl, scooping the hot, thick mixture into my mouth as fast as I could swallow. I didn't care that I was graceless, that I was probably disgusting to watch. It was the first real food, the first hot meal I'd had in so long I couldn't even remember the last one. The meat was tender and flavorful, the vegetables cooked to perfect softness. There were herbs, I couldn't identify seasonings that spoke of someone who understood that food was more than mere fuel. This was a meal prepared by someone who took care with such things, who found satisfaction in doing even simple tasks well. When I was finished, the bowl scraped clean with my spoon, I looked up to find him watching me, with that same unsettling stillness. There was no judgment in his expression, no disgust at my display of desperate hunger. If anything, there might have been approval, satisfaction that his food had been appreciated. He took both bowls without comment, rinsed them in a bucket of water that sat on a shelf near the door, and set them aside to dry. Then he walked to his bed, pulled off his boots, and lay down on top of the covers, still wearing his coat and hat. Within moments, his breathing had become deep and regular. He either trusted me completely or was feigning sleep to see what I would do. Either way, he'd made himself vulnerable, and the implications of that gesture weren't lost on me. I remained at the table, the fire's warmth making me drowsy for the first time in months. Outside, wind howled around the cabin, with a lonely, menacing sound that spoke of the vast emptiness surrounding us. But inside, it was warm and safe and quiet. I studied the man on the bed, my owner, my savior, my captor, depending on how you chose to look at it. I realized I didn't even know his name. He was a complete mystery, this silent figure who'd spent $80 to buy me, and then treated me with more basic human dignity than I'd experienced in longer than I cared to remember. After what felt like hours, I finally rose and went to the cot he'd prepared for me. I lay down carefully, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin, but I didn't undress. The shift I wore was the only garment I owned, and removing it would leave me too vulnerable, too exposed. I lay there listening to the fire crackle and the wind scream around the cabin's walls. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the cold dread of what the night might bring. I didn't lie awake wondering what fresh humiliation or pain awaited me in the morning. Instead, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: quiet. Not peace exactly, but the absence of immediate fear. It was enough. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, I woke to the sound of restless movement from the other side of the room. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing embers, and cold was beginning to creep back into the cabin, like a living thing. In the dim red light, I could see him shifting on his narrow bed, and I heard the soft sound of his teeth chattering despite his coat and blanket. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and even his superior bedding wasn't enough to keep the chill at bay. Without thinking, without analyzing my motives, or considering the potential consequences, I got up from my cot. I took the heavy blanket he'd given me earlier, the one that had probably saved my life on the ride here, and walked quietly across the room. I stood over him for a moment, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake him. In sleep, his face looked younger, the hard lines softened by vulnerability. He was just a man after all, not the intimidating figure he'd seemed during our journey. Gently moving with infinite care, I draped the blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders. He stirred at the contact, a low murmur escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. His hand, which had been resting on his chest, twitched slightly, as if some deep sleeping part of him recognized the gesture for what it was: simple human kindness offered without expectation of reward. I retreated to my cot, pulling my own thin blanket close, and discovered something remarkable. Despite the cold air, despite having given away my best source of warmth, I felt heated from within. There was a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the act of caring for another person. For the first time in months, I had chosen to give, rather than merely receive or endure. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental, the first step back toward becoming human again. When I woke again, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the cabin's single window, and the smell of coffee was heavy in the air. He was already up, fully dressed, tending a new fire with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. He glanced up as I stirred, and for just a moment our eyes met across the small room. There was something different in his expression, a subtle warming, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded, once the gesture carrying more weight than a dozen words from another man. "Coffee's ready," he said, his voice rough with mourning and disuse. They were the first words he'd spoken to me since purchasing me at the auction, and they carried the casual domesticity of a normal morning between normal people. I sat up carefully, acutely aware of my disheveled appearance, my tangled hair and wrinkled dress. But he'd already turned back to his tasks, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups with the same care he'd shown the night before with the stew. The coffee was strong and black and bitter, but it was hot and real, and drinking it felt like a small act of civilization in the wilderness. We sat at the small table in comfortable quiet, watching the fire and listening to the wind outside gradually subside. Storms passing, he observed, nodding toward the window where the light was growing stronger. Be able to get to the woodpile today. It was a practical statement, but it carried implications. He was thinking ahead, planning for our continued survival, speaking as if my presence here was simply an accepted fact, rather than a temporary arrangement. "What's your name?" I asked, suddenly the question emerging before I could stop it. He looked at me over his coffee cup, gray eyes steady and unreadable. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer, that I'd overstepped some invisible boundary. "Silas," he said finally. "Silas Marlowe." The name suited him, solid, unpretentious, carrying the weight of generations without ostentation. I turned it over in my mind, matching it to the man across from me. I started, then stopped. Was I still who I'd been before? Did that girl even exist anymore? Or had she died somewhere along the road that led to that auction block? "I know," he said quietly, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. "You know what? That you're more than a number." He set down his cup and looked directly at me. "Whatever happened to you, whoever you were before you're here now, that's what matters." It was the longest speech I'd heard him make, and the kindness in it nearly undid me completely. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I fought them back. I'd learned not to cry. Tears were weakness, and weakness invited cruelty. "What do you want from me?" I asked the question, emerging harsher than I'd intended. He considered this, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Want," he repeated, as if the concept was foreign to him. "I want to survive the winter. I want the snow to melt come spring. I want to not freeze to death in my sleep." He looked at me directly, then his gray eyes holding mine. "As for you, I want you to decide what you want. When you're ready." The simple humanity of it staggered me. He wasn't making demands or setting conditions. He was offering something I'd forgotten existed: choice. The luxury of deciding my own fate, of having wants and preferences that mattered. We finished our coffee in silence, and then the real work began. Survival in the high country winter was a full-time occupation that required constant attention to detail. Every task was critical, every oversight potentially fatal. Silas moved through his morning routine, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for years, and gradually he began including me in the work. First, we dealt with the horses, leading them from their shelter to a small paddock where they could move around and get some exercise. The animals were well cared for, their coats thick and healthy, their tack properly maintained. Silas checked each horse carefully, running his hands over their legs and examining their hooves with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a lame horse could mean death in this country. Good horses are worth more than gold out here, he explained as he worked his hands gentle but sure as he checked the mare's shoes. They'll carry you through places where nothing else can go get you home when you're lost or hurt. You treat them right, and they'll save your life. Next came the wood. The cabin's survival depended on maintaining a constant supply of fuel for the fire, and the work was backbreaking. Silas wielded his axe with the rhythm of long practice, splitting logs with clean, powerful strokes that sent chips flying in all directions. The sound echoed off the surrounding trees like gunshots, sharp and definitive. I watched him work, mesmerized by the easy strength in his movements, the way he could drive the axe blade exactly where he wanted it, with seemingly effortless precision. His breath formed clouds in the cold air, and despite the freezing temperature, he worked up enough of a sweat to remove his heavy coat. "Can you stack?" he asked, nodding toward the growing pile of split wood. I nodded and set to work arranging the pieces according to size and type. My hands, soft from months of inactivity, were soon raw and blistered, but I welcomed the pain. It was clean pain, honest pain, the kind that came from useful work rather than cruelty or degradation. Silas noticed the condition of my hands when we broke for a midday meal. Without comment, he disappeared into a wooden chest and returned with a small tin of salve that smelled of pine and beeswax. "Oh, for the blisters," he said simply, setting it beside my plate. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke to a character that noticed suffering and sought to alleviate it without being asked. I applied the salve, carefully feeling the immediate relief as it cooled the burning sensation in my palms. That afternoon, he began teaching me about the trap lines, rabbits and foxes mostly. He explained as we made our way through the snow-laden forest on snowshoes he'd fashioned for me from bent willow and rawhide. Sometimes a deer if we're lucky. The meat keeps us alive, and the pelts can be traded for supplies come spring. The traps were scattered throughout the woods in a carefully planned network that took advantage of natural game trails and feeding areas. Each one was a small masterpiece of engineering designed to kill quickly and humanely, while preventing the catch from being stolen by scavengers. "The secret," Silas said, as he demonstrated the proper way to set a snare, "is thinking like the animal. Where would you go for water, for shelter? What path would you take between food and safety?" I watched his hands as he worked, noting the care he took to disguise human scent, the precision with which he positioned each component. There was artistry in it, a deep understanding of the natural world that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. "Why do you live out here?" I asked as we checked the last trap of the day. So far from everything. He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Sometimes a man needs distance," he said. "Sometimes the world gets too crowded, too complicated. Out here things are simple. You work or you die. You're honest or you suffer the consequences." There was pain in that answer, old hurt that he kept carefully buried. I sensed that asking for details would be unwelcome, so I let the matter drop. We all had our secrets, our reasons for ending up in places like this. That evening, as we sat by the fire after another meal of venison stew, I noticed him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was assessment in his gaze, but also something that might have been approval. "You learn fast," he said finally. "Most people from back east, they can't adapt to this kind of life. Too soft, too used to having others do the hard work." "I grew up on a farm," I replied. Before everything went wrong. I know about hard work." He nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "What happened to your family, I mean?" The question was gently asked, but it still hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I was back in that little farmhouse, watching my parents waste away from fever, while I did everything I could to save them. Sickness, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Some kind of fever that came through the valley. It took my parents first, then my younger brother. I tried. I did everything I could, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Even now, months later, the guilt was overwhelming. I'd survived when they hadn't, and sometimes that felt like the cruelest joke of all. After they died, the bank came for the farm. Said we owed more than the land was worth. I had nowhere to go, no family left, no money. I looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. I made some bad choices, trusted the wrong people, and eventually I ended up on that auction block. It was the most I'd told anyone about my past, and speaking the words aloud felt like lancing a wound. Painful, but necessary. Silas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, with an expression that spoke of his own familiarity with loss and regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for what happened to your family, for what happened to you." There was such genuine feeling in those words that I felt tears burning behind my eyes again. But this time I didn't fight them. I let them come silent tracks down my cheeks that caught the firelight like silver. He didn't try to comfort me with empty platitudes or false reassurances. He just sat there sharing the weight of sorrow in the way that only someone who'd carried his own burden of grief could do. Later that night, as I lay in my narrow cot, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, I realized something had changed between us. The careful distance we'd maintained was still there, but it was different now. Less about fear and mistrust, and more about mutual respect for boundaries and private pain. For the first time since my parents' death, I didn't feel completely alone in the world. It was a dangerous feeling, hope, but I found I couldn't quite push it away. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the demands of survival and the harsh realities of mountain winter. We woke before dawn to rebuild the fire and prepare coffee, and whatever passed for breakfast, usually leftover stew or cornbread, made from carefully hoarded flour. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a stark contrast to the chaos and uncertainty that had defined my life for so many months. Silas proved to be a patient teacher, showing me the dozens of small skills necessary for survival in this harsh environment. He taught me how to read the weather by observing the behavior of clouds and wind, how to identify edible plants that might be found even in winter, how to preserve meat and vegetables for long-term storage. Most importantly, he taught me how to handle firearms. Every person out here needs to be able to defend themselves, he said matter-of-factly as he showed me how to load and clean his spare rifle. Animals weather bad men. There's plenty of things that can kill you if you're not prepared. The rifle was heavier than I'd expected, and the recoil when I first fired it nearly knocked me backward. But Silas was patient, adjusting my stance and grip until I could hit targets with reasonable accuracy. "You're a natural," he observed after I'd managed to put 3 shots in a row through a tin can he'd set up at 50 yards. "Good eye, steady hands. Most people take months to shoot that well." The praise warmed me, more than it should have. I'd grown hungry for approval, for any sign that I had value beyond the purely physical. As the days passed, our conversations gradually became longer and more natural. Silas remained a man of few words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often surprisingly insightful. He'd clearly spent years observing human nature, and his comments about the world and its inhabitants carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "People are like animals," he said one evening as we worked on repairing a broken trap. "Most of them are just trying to survive, find food and shelter and safety for their young. But some," he shook his head grimly, "some develop a taste for cruelty, for causing pain, just because they can. Those ones are more dangerous than any wolf or bear." I thought about the men who'd bought and sold me, about the casual brutality I'd witnessed and experienced, and I knew he was right. There were predators among humans that were far more vicious than anything found in nature. How do you tell the difference? I asked. Between the good ones and the bad ones. He considered this, his weathered hands continuing their precise work on the trap mechanism. Watch their eyes, he said finally. Watch how they treat things that can't fight back: animals, children, people who are hurt or scared. A man's true nature comes out when he thinks no one important is watching. It was a lesson I wished I'd learned earlier before I'd trusted the wrong people and ended up in chains. One morning, about 3 weeks after my arrival at the cabin, Silas announced that he needed to make a trip to the nearest settlement for supplies. It's a 2-day ride in good weather, he explained, checking the condition of his saddle and tack. With the snow this deep might take longer. I'll be gone at least 4 days, maybe 5. The thought of being alone in that isolated cabin filled me with anxiety. Not fear of him. I'd long since realized that whatever his intentions, they didn't include harming me, but fear of my own ability to survive without his steady presence and expertise. What if something happens? I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. What if the fire goes out, or animals come around, or... You'll be fine, he said with quiet confidence. You know how to tend the fire, how to care for the horses, how to use the rifle if you need to. The food will last, and I'll be back before you know it. He paused in his preparations and looked at me directly. I'm not leaving you here as punishment, Ara. I'm leaving you because I trust you to take care of things while I'm gone. The use of my name the first time he'd spoken it since that night weeks ago sent a warm shock through me. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being number 17, or the woman, and had become a person with an identity he respected. How do you know my name? I asked, suddenly realizing I'd never actually told him. He was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling on the leather he'd been adjusting. You talk in your sleep sometimes, he said finally. You call out for your mother, tell her you're sorry. You say your name like you're trying not to forget it. The knowledge that he'd been listening to my unconscious confessions should have embarrassed me, but instead I felt oddly comforted. Even in sleep, some part of me had been fighting to maintain my identity, and he'd been witness to that struggle. I won't forget, I said quietly. Not anymore. He nodded and resumed his preparations. Before he left, he showed me where he kept emergency supplies, extra food ammunition, medical supplies, even a small bag of silver coins, in case I needed to trade for something essential. If something happens to me, he said matter-of-factly, if I don't come back, you take whatever you need and head south to Colorado Territory. There's good people there who'll help you get back on your feet. The casual way he discussed his potential death chilled me more than I expected. Somewhere over the past weeks, I'd begun to depend on his presence in ways I was only now beginning to understand. Nothing's going to happen to you, I said firmly, as if saying it could make it true. He smiled, then the first genuine smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. The hard lines softened, and I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been under different circumstances. On Beer, I appreciate the confidence, he said. But out here, you plan for the worst and hope for the best. He mounted his horse in the pale pre-dawn light, his breath and the animals forming clouds in the frigid air. For a moment, he sat there looking down at me, and I had the strangest feeling that he was memorizing my face. Take care of yourself, Ara, he said softly. Then he turned his horse toward the trail and rode into the gray morning mist, leaving me alone with my thoughts and fears. The first day passed uneventfully. I followed the routines he'd taught me, tending the fire, caring for the remaining horse, checking the nearby trap lines. The work kept my hands busy, but my mind wandered constantly to the man, riding through dangerous country, vulnerable to weather and wild animals, and the kind of men who preyed on solitary travelers. By the second day, I was talking to myself, just to hear a human voice. The silence of the mountains was complete and profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the distant howl of wolves. I found myself listening constantly for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, straining my ears for any sign of his return. On the third day, a storm moved in. It began as a few scattered snowflakes that danced in the wind like tiny white dancers. But by afternoon, it had developed into a full blizzard that turned the world into a wall of white. Wind howled around the cabin with demonic fury, and snow piled up against the door and windows until I felt completely buried. I kept the fire burning bright and tried not to think about Silas caught somewhere in this storm, possibly lost, possibly freezing to death, while I sat safe and warm in his cabin. The guilt was almost overwhelming. He'd risked this journey to get supplies, probably things we both needed to survive the remainder of winter. The storm raged for 2 full days. When it finally broke, the world outside was transformed, buried under several feet of new snow that sparkled like diamonds in the returning sunlight. I dug my way out of the cabin and stood in the blinding brightness, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. 2 more days passed with no sign of him. I began to face the possibility that he wasn't coming back, that I was truly alone in this wilderness, with winter still months from ending. The prospect terrified me, but it also sparked something I'd thought was dead, and the will to survive, to fight for my own life, regardless of the odds. On the evening of the 7th day, as I sat by the fire, trying to decide how long to wait before implementing his emergency plan, I heard the faint sound of a horse moving through snow. I grabbed the rifle and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. A single rider was approaching the cabin, his horse moving slowly through the deep drifts. In the dim light, I couldn't make out details, but something about the silhouette looked wrong. The rider was slumped forward in his saddle, and the horse was picking its own way rather than being guided. As they drew closer, I realized why the man was barely conscious, swaying dangerously with each step his mount took. I threw open the door and ran outside, not bothering with coat or boots. The horse stopped when it saw me, and I could see that its rider was indeed Silas, but he was in bad shape. His face was gray with exhaustion and pain, and blood had frozen on his left temple where some kind of wound had opened. "Silas," I called out, reaching for him as he began to slide from the saddle. He fell into my arms, nearly taking us both down into the snow. He was conscious, but barely, his skin cold as ice despite his heavy clothing. "I got caught in the storm," he mumbled against my shoulder. "Horse threw me, hit my head on a rock." Somehow I managed to get him inside and onto his bed. His clothes were soaked through, and he was shivering uncontrollably, signs of dangerous hypothermia. Working frantically, I stripped off his wet garments and wrapped him in every blanket I could find, then built up the fire until the cabin was almost unbearably hot. For the next several hours, I wasn't sure he was going to survive. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his skin remained cold and clammy despite the heat. I heated water and forced him to drink warm broth, made him swallow spoonfuls of honey to get sugar into his system. Gradually, slowly, his condition began to improve. Color returned to his face, and his breathing deepened. By morning, he was sleeping naturally, rather than hovering in the gray zone between consciousness and unconsciousness. I spent that entire night watching over him, adjusting blankets, monitoring his breathing, feeding the fire to keep the cabin warm. It was the longest night of my life, filled with the terrible possibility that I might lose the only person who'd shown me genuine kindness since my family's death. When he finally woke late the next afternoon, his gray eyes were clear and focused. He looked around the cabin, taking in the evidence of my all-night vigil, the stack of wood I'd brought inside the pot of broth still warming by the fire, my own exhausted state. "You saved my life," he said simply, his voice rough from fever and dehydration. "You saved mine first," I replied, settling into the chair beside his bed with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something new in his expression, not just gratitude, but a deeper recognition of the bond that had formed between us during these weeks of shared survival. "I was afraid I wouldn't make it back," he admitted quietly. "Afraid of what would happen to you alone out here." I would have managed, I said, and realized I actually believed it. Somewhere during the past week, I'd discovered reserves of strength and competence I'd forgotten I possessed. I know you would have, he said, and the respect in his voice warmed me more than the blazing fire. You're stronger than you know, Ara. Stronger than what happened to you. It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to me, and it carried the weight of absolute conviction. For the first time, in longer than I could remember, I began to believe it might be true. As Silas recovered from his ordeal, which took the better part of a week, our relationship shifted into something new and deeper. The crisis had stripped away the last barriers of formality and caution between us. We'd seen each other at our most vulnerable, and neither had found the other wanting. He told me about his journey, about getting caught in the blizzard while still a day's ride from the settlement, about his horse spooked by a bear and throwing him against a boulder that left him with a concussion and no clear memory of how he'd found his way home. The mare knew the way, he said, gently stroking the neck of the horse that had carried him to safety. Smart animal. Smarter than her rider, apparently. I told him about my week alone, about the fear and the determination, about the moment when I'd realized I could survive on my own, if necessary. The knowledge had changed something fundamental in my relationship with the world. I was no longer merely a victim of circumstances, but someone capable of taking action to shape my own fate. I've been thinking, I said one evening as we sat by the fire, both of us mending clothes in the economical way of people who couldn't afford to waste anything, about what happens when winter ends. He looked up from the sock he was darning, his needle poised in mid-stitch. What about it? I don't know where I'll go, I admitted. What I'll do? I can't go back to where I came from. There's nothing left there. And I don't have money or family or any way to start over somewhere else. He was quiet for a long time, his attention apparently focused on his mending. But I could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he held himself. And I knew he was thinking hard about something. You could stay, he said finally, not looking up from his work. If you wanted to. There's plenty of work here, more than one person can handle properly. And it gets lonely sometimes, all this silence. The offer hung in the air between us like a tangible thing. He'd phrased it carefully, casually, as if it were merely a practical arrangement rather than something that could change both our lives forever. What would that make me? I asked quietly. Your hired hand, your housekeeper, your... I couldn't quite say the word, but it lingered in the space between us. Now he did look up, his gray eyes meeting mine directly. It would make you whatever you wanted to be, he said with quiet intensity. A partner, if that suited you. Someone to share the work and the risks and the rewards of this life. Someone to talk to when the silence gets too heavy. He set down his mending and leaned forward slightly. I won't lie to you, Ara. It's a hard life out here. Dangerous, sometimes lonely most of the time. You'd be giving up any chance of civilization, of society, of the kinds of things most women want. What kinds of things? I asked, though I thought I knew. Security, respectability, a house in town with neighbors and social calls and fancy dresses. He gestured around the sparse cabin. This is all I have to offer. This cabin, this land, this way of living. It's not much by most standards. I looked around the room that had become my sanctuary, at the simple furniture and practical supplies, at the man who'd given me back my name and my dignity and my sense of self-worth. It wasn't much by society's standards, perhaps, but it was honest and real and infinitely precious to me. It's enough, I said simply. More than enough. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or joy, or both. He reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand in his calloused fingers intertwining with mine. Then stay, he said softly. Stay and help me build something here. Something that belongs to both of us. I looked down at our joined hands, his so much larger and more weathered than mine, but fitting together as if they'd been designed for exactly this purpose. For the first time since my parents' death, I felt like I was home. "Yes," I whispered. "I'll stay." He lifted our joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles, the gesture so tender it brought tears to my eyes. But these were good tears, tears of relief and gratitude, and something that might have been the beginning of love. Outside, the wind howled around our cabin. But inside we were warm and safe and no longer alone. We had found something precious in this harsh wilderness, not just shelter from the cold, but shelter for our damaged hearts. The rest of winter passed like a dream of contentment I'd never dared imagine possible. With the question of my future settled, the last barriers between Silas and me dissolved completely. We became true partners in every sense, sharing not just the work of survival, but the deeper intimacies of two people learning to trust completely. The change was gradual, but profound. Our conversations grew longer and more personal as we shared the stories of our lives, the dreams we'd harbored, the losses we'd endured. I told him about my childhood on the farm, about the parents who'd loved me and taught me to value honest work and simple pleasures. He spoke of his own past, though I sensed there were depths he wasn't ready to reveal. What I learned was that he'd been a lawman once somewhere back east before circumstances had driven him to seek the anonymity of the frontier. He'd had education, position, respect, all of which he'd abandoned for reasons he kept carefully guarded. Sometimes a man has to choose between doing what's right and doing what's safe, he said one evening when I pressed gently for details. I chose right, and it cost me everything I thought I wanted. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe I needed to lose all that to find what I actually needed. He looked at me as he said this, and I understood that I was part of what he'd found in the wilderness, not just companionship, but purpose and peace, and the kind of happiness that couldn't be bought or earned through conventional means. Our physical relationship developed with the same careful patience that characterized everything else about our partnership. There were no demands or expectations, just a gradual increase in casual touches, his hand on my shoulder as he passed behind my chair, my fingers brushing his as we worked side by side, the way we naturally moved closer together as we sat by the fire in the evenings. The first time he kissed me, really kissed me, not just the gentle press of lips to forehead or hand, was on a night when we'd been talking late by the fire about our hopes for spring. The conversation had grown intimate, full of shared dreams and tentative plans, and when he reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face, something in the moment made it natural for him to lean closer, for me to lift my face to his. It was gentle and sweet and entirely different from the brutal kisses I'd endured during my captivity. This was a question asked and answered, an offer made and accepted, a promise of tenderness and respect that moved me to tears. "I love you," he whispered against my lips, the words emerging as if they'd been pulled from the deepest part of his soul. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore, but I do. "I love you too," I replied, and realized it was absolutely true. Somewhere in the long winter nights and shared struggles, gratitude had transformed into something much deeper and more lasting. That night, for the first time, I didn't sleep on the narrow cot across the room. I shared his bed, his warmth, his strength, and discovered that physical intimacy could be something beautiful rather than merely endured. In his arms, I felt cherished and safe, and completely loved emotions I'd begun to think I'd never experience again. When spring finally came to the high country, it arrived with all the sudden drama of mountain weather. One day the world was locked in winter's grip, and the next streams were running free, and the first green shoots were pushing through the snow. The air grew soft and sweet, filled with the sound of rushing water and the calls of returning birds. Silas had been right about the amount of work required to maintain a homestead. As soon as the weather permitted, we were busy from dawn to dusk repairing winter damage to the cabin, and outbuildings, clearing new ground for a larger garden, tending the horses and the small herd of cattle he'd acquired through trade. But it wasn't drudgery. Working beside him, contributing my own skills and strength to our shared enterprise, I felt useful and valued in ways I'd never experienced before. Every fence we mended, every row we planted, every improvement we made to our little corner of the wilderness was a step toward building something that belonged to both of us. By midsummer, I knew I was carrying his child. The realization came gradually, a morning when the smell of coffee made me queasy, a growing tenderness in my breasts, the subtle changes in my body that spoke of new life taking root. When I was certain, I told him one evening as we sat on the porch he'd built watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Are you pleased?" I asked, suddenly uncertain despite the obvious love between us. He turned to look at me, his gray eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been joy. "Pleased," he repeated as if the word was inadequate. "Ara, I never imagined I'd have a family, a child of my own." He reached for me, then pulling me close against his side, his large hand coming to rest protectively over my still flat stomach. "More than pleased," he murmured against my hair. "Grateful, blessed, terrified that I won't know how to be a good father. You'll be wonderful." I assured him, and I meant it completely. I'd seen his gentleness with animals, his patience in teaching me the skills I needed to survive, his quiet strength in the face of adversity. Any child would be fortunate to have such a man as a father. The baby was born in early spring as the world was awakening from its winter sleep. The birth was difficult. We were far from any doctor or midwife, and Silas had to serve as both, but our son entered the world healthy and strong, with a powerful voice that echoed through the cabin like a declaration of intent. We named him Thomas after Silas's father, and he was perfect in every way. Tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength, dark hair that curled like his father's, and eyes that would eventually settle into the same clear gray. Watching Silas hold his son for the first time, seeing the wonder and tenderness that transformed his weathered features, I understood finally and completely what home meant. It wasn't a place or a building or even a piece of land. It was this feeling of belonging so complete that everything else, the past, the pain, the fear, simply fell away. But our peace was not destined to last undisturbed. It was late in Thomas's first summer when trouble found us again. I was in the garden picking vegetables for dinner while the baby slept in his cradle on the porch when I heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Silas had gone to check the trap lines and wouldn't return until evening, leaving me alone with our son. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and my blood turned to ice when I recognized the man in the lead. It was Finch, the trapper, who'd bid against Silas at the auction more than a year ago. But he looked different now, harder, meaner, with the kind of barely controlled violence that radiated from men who'd crossed lines they couldn't uncross. The 2 men with him were strangers, but they had the same predatory look in their eyes, the same air of casual brutality that I'd learned to fear during my months of captivity. "Ah, well, well," Finch called out as they rode into the clearing, his voice carrying a note of malicious satisfaction. "Look what we have here. The little auction house special all settled in and playing house." I straightened slowly, my hand moving instinctively to the rifle that Silas insisted I keep close whenever he was away. But the weapon was leaning against the porch railing, and the men were too close for me to reach it safely. "Mr. Finch," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What brings you here?" He dismounted with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving me. "Just being neighborly," he said with a grin that held no warmth. "Thought I'd check on how you're settling in. See if that silent partner of yours is taking proper care of his investment." The other men had also dismounted, and they were spreading out in a way that suggested this was not a social call. My heart began to race as I realized how vulnerable I was, alone with a helpless infant and no means of escape. "Silas isn't here," I said, backing slowly toward the porch where Thomas still slept peacefully, unaware of the danger that had arrived at our home. I know he isn't, Finch replied, his grin widening. Been watching this place for days, learning your routines. Amazing how predictable folks get when they think they're safe. He took a step closer, and I could smell the stench of unwashed body and stale alcohol that surrounded him like a cloud. You know, I never did get over losing that bidding war. $80 was a lot of money to me, and I hate to lose. Been thinking about it ever since, wondering what made you worth such a price. Silas will be back soon, I said, continuing my slow retreat. He won't be pleased to find you here. Oh, I'm counting on it. Finch laughed, a sound devoid of humor. See, I've learned some interesting things about your Silas Marlowe since that day at the auction. Turns out he's quite the famous man back in Deadwood. Quite the hero, some might say. My blood chilled at the mention of Deadwood. I'd suspected Silas had secrets in his past, but the way Finch spoke suggested something more serious than I'd imagined. Don't know what you're talking about, I said, but my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Of course you don't, Finch sneered. He wouldn't tell his little woman about being a sheriff, about gunning down Jake Finch in the street like a dog. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sheriff. Jake Finch. Suddenly the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed began falling into place. The law book in his chest, the official papers, the way he'd handled firearms with professional competence, the careful way he'd spoken about his past. Jake was my brother. Finch continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Younger brother, matter of fact. And your precious Silas murdered him in cold blood, then ran like a coward when folks started asking questions. I don't believe you, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I was remembering conversations, hints, the haunted look that sometimes crossed Silas's face when he thought I wasn't watching. Believe what you want. Finch shrugged. Don't change the facts. Silas Marlowe is a wanted man, and there's a price on his head that would set me up for life. But first, his eyes moved from me to the sleeping baby on the porch. First, I think I'll take what should have been mine to begin with. The threat to Thomas galvanized me into action. Whatever Silas had done in his past, whatever secrets he'd kept from me, none of that mattered compared to protecting our child. I lunged for the rifle, but one of Finch's companions was faster, intercepting me before I could reach the weapon. Easy there, wildcat. The man laughed, his hands rough and painful as they grabbed my arms. Nobody needs to get hurt if you just cooperate. Let her go, Murphy, Finch ordered. I want her willing, at least at first. More fun that way. Murphy released me, but he stayed close, ready to grab me again if I tried to run. Not that there was anywhere to go. We were miles from the nearest neighbor. Even if I could somehow escape, I couldn't leave Thomas behind. What do you want? I asked, though I was terribly afraid I already knew. Justice, Finch replied, but the word sounded obscene coming from his lips. Your man killed my brother, ruined my family. Now I'm going to return the favor. He nodded to the third man, who I now noticed was carrying a coil of rope. When Silas gets back, he's going to find his woman and his baby in a very unfortunate situation. And when he tries to play hero well, accidents happen in the wilderness. Wild animals, tragic falls, all sorts of ways a man can meet his end. The plan was clear now, and its cruelty took my breath away. They intended to use Thomas and me as bait, to lure Silas into a trap, then kill all of us to satisfy Finch's twisted need for revenge. Please, I said, abandoning pride in favor of desperation. Whatever happened between you and Silas, I had nothing to do with it. Neither did the baby. We're innocent. Nobody's innocent, Finch snarled. You chose to throw in with a killer to bear his child. That makes you part of it. The man with the rope was approaching the porch where Thomas still slept, and maternal instinct overrode every other consideration. I broke away from Murphy's relaxed guard and threw myself between the stranger and my baby, snatching Thomas up from his cradle and backing against the cabin wall. "Don't touch him," I said fiercely, clutching my son against my chest. "Whatever you do to me, leave the baby alone. He's done nothing wrong." "Nothing," Finch said mockingly. "Mother love. Jake had a little girl, you know. Sweet thing barely walking when your husband put a bullet in her daddy's chest. Wonder what happened to her after that." The words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt everything I thought I knew about the man I loved. And they succeeded at least partially. What if I'd been wrong about Silas? What if beneath his gentle exterior lay the heart of a killer? But even as these doubts assailed me, I remembered other things: the careful way he handled wounded animals, the patience he'd shown in teaching me to survive, the tenderness with which he held our son. Whatever he might have done in his past, I knew the man he was now. "I don't care what he did before I met him," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I know who he is now, and he's a good man. We'll see how good he is when he has to choose between saving his family and saving his own skin," Finch replied. But before he could give further orders to his men, we all heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed through the forest. Silas was returning early from his trap run, perhaps warned by some instinct that something was wrong. Well, perfect timing. Finch grinned, drawing his pistol. "Murphy, you and Carlson get into position by the trees. When he rides into the clearing, we'll have him in a crossfire." The two men moved quickly to flank the path Silas would take, leaving Finch alone with Thomas and me. He grabbed my arm and pressed the barrel of his gun against my temple, the metal cold and threatening against my skin. "One sound from you and the baby dies first," he whispered. "Understand?" I nodded, terror for Thomas overriding every other consideration. Whatever happened to me, I had to keep my son safe. Silas rode into the clearing moments later, his gray eyes immediately taking in the scene, the three horses that didn't belong, Finch, holding a gun to my head, our baby in my arms. I saw his expression change from confusion to understanding, to a cold, controlled fury that was more frightening than any display of anger I'd ever witnessed. "Let them go, Finch," he said quietly, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Your quarrel is with me." "Well, well," Finch called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. "The famous Sheriff Marlowe. Took you long enough to show your face." Silas's jaw tightened at the title, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not a sheriff anymore. Haven't been for years." "No, but you're still a killer," Finch spat. "Still the man who murdered my brother in cold blood. Your brother was about to shoot an innocent child." Silas replied, his gray eyes never leaving Finch's face. "I gave him every chance to surrender, to walk away. He chose to die instead." "Liar," Finch screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Jake was a good man, a loving father. Jake was a vicious animal who enjoyed hurting innocent people," Silas said with quiet conviction. "And if you're anything like him, this won't end well for any of us." I could see the tension building toward an explosion, and I knew that once the shooting started, Thomas and I would be caught in the crossfire. Desperately, I tried to think of something, anything that might give Silas an advantage, or create an opportunity for escape. Then I remembered the bear trap. Silas kept one set near the cabin as protection against large predators that might threaten our livestock. It was hidden in the tall grass beside the porch, its steel jaws powerful enough to break a man's leg, its chain anchored to a heavy log that prevented trapped animals from dragging it away. If I could somehow lure Finch closer to the trap. "Please," I said, putting all the fear and desperation I could muster into my voice. "Don't hurt my baby. I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt Thomas." Finch's grip on my arm loosened slightly as he turned to look at me. His attention diverted from Silas for just a moment. "Now you're talking sense," he said. "Maybe we can work something out after all." I took a half step toward the porch, and then another, gradually drawing him toward the hidden trap. I know where Silas keeps his money. I lied. Silver dollars, quite a lot of them. More than enough to make this worth your while. Keep talking. Finch said, his greed overriding his caution, as I'd hoped it would. Inside the cabin, I continued, taking another careful step. Hidden under a loose floorboard. I can show you. We were almost at the trap now, so close I could see the edge of its steel mechanism through the grass. But I needed him to move just a little farther to position himself directly over the trigger plate. Ara, no. Silas said quietly, and I realized he'd seen what I was attempting to do. It's too dangerous. But it was too late to stop now. I pretended to stumble, crying out as if in pain, and Finch instinctively stepped forward to steady me. His foot came down directly on the trap's trigger plate. The mechanism sprung with a sound like breaking bones, the steel jaws slamming shut just above Finch's knee with crushing force. His scream was inhuman, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the surrounding trees like a death cry. The pistol fell from his hand as he collapsed, both hands clawing frantically at the trap that held him fast. Blood was already beginning to pool in the grass around the steel teeth that had bit deep into flesh and bone. Silas moved the instant Finch went down, rolling to his left as Murphy and Carlson opened fire from their positions by the trees. I heard the whistle of bullets passing close to where he'd been standing, saw him come up with his own pistol drawn and ready. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Silas had the advantage of superior marksmanship and cooler nerves, and within moments both of Finch's companions were down. Murphy dead with a bullet through his heart, Carlson wounded and trying to crawl back into the forest. "Stay down, Carlson." Silas called out, his pistol trained on the wounded man. "Move another inch and I'll finish what I started." Carlson froze, intelligent enough to recognize the voice of someone who meant exactly what he said. Silas walked over to where Finch lay trapped and bleeding, his face a mask of controlled fury. "The key to that trap is in town," he said conversationally. 2 days' ride in good weather. You'll bleed to death long before anyone could get back here, even if they tried. Finch looked up at him with eyes that were already growing glassy with shock and blood loss. "Please," he whispered. "I got a family, kids who need me." "So did the people your brother terrorized," Silas replied without mercy. "So did the little girl he would have killed if I hadn't stopped him." He knelt beside the dying man, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Jake got exactly what he deserved, and so are you." Finch's struggles grew weaker as blood continued to pool around the trap. Within minutes, his breathing became shallow and irregular, and shortly after that, it stopped altogether. Silas stood and walked over to where Carlson lay, wounded, his pistol steady and ready. "What's your name?" he asked. "Tom Carlson," the man gasped, clutching a shoulder that was obviously shattered by Silas's bullet. "Well, Tom Carlson, you have 2 choices," Silas said matter-of-factly. "You can ride out of here right now and forget you ever saw this place, or you can join your friends in hell. What's it going to be?" Carlson didn't hesitate. "I'll ride out," he said quickly. "Never saw you, never been here. Smart man." Silas nodded. "But if I ever see you again, or hear that you've been talking about what happened here, I'll track you down and finish what I started today. Understand?" Carlson nodded vigorously, then struggled to his feet and stumbled toward his horse. Within moments, he was riding away as fast as his wounded condition would allow, leaving only dust and the memory of violence behind. Silas holstered his pistol and walked over to where I stood, holding Thomas, who had somehow slept through the entire gunfight. His gray eyes searched my face, looking for signs of injury or trauma. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, his hands running over my arms and shoulders, checking for wounds. "I'm fine," I assured him, then looked down at our son, who was just beginning to stir in my arms. "We're both fine." Silas pulled us both into his embrace, holding us close against his chest as if he could somehow protect us from the world through sheer force of will. I could feel his heart racing, could sense the adrenaline and fear that were only now beginning to fade. "I'm sorry," he said roughly against my hair. "I'm sorry you had to see that had to be part of it. This is exactly what I was trying to escape when I came here." I pulled back enough to look into his face, seeing the pain and regret that lined his features. "Tell me," I said quietly. "Tell me what really happened in Deadwood." He was quiet for a long moment, his arms still around us, his eyes focused on something I couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but filled with old sorrow. "I was sheriff there for 3 years, he began. "Good years mostly. The town was growing, becoming civilized, and I was proud of the part I played in that. I had a deputy I trusted, a woman I was planning to marry, a future that looked bright and promising." He paused, his jaw tightening with remembered pain. "Then Jake Finch and his gang decided to rob Henley's general store. Old man Henley was there with his granddaughter, sweet little girl about 6 years old, visiting from back east. I waited, holding Thomas close, giving Silas time to find the words for what was clearly a painful memory. I tried to talk them out of it," he continued. "Offered to let them take what they wanted and leave peacefully. But Jake had a mean streak a mile wide. He liked hurting people, especially when they couldn't fight back." Silas's eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of years of guilt and regret in their gray depths. "He put his gun to that little girl's head and said he'd kill her just for the fun of it. Said he'd always wondered what it would feel like to shoot a child. The horror of it made me gasp. Now I understood why Silas carried such darkness in his past. He'd been forced to make an impossible choice, and the weight of it had been eating at him ever since. I had no choice," he said quietly. I could see it in his eyes. He meant every word. "So I shot him." "You saved that little girl's life," I said firmly. "You did what any decent man would have done." That's what I told myself. Silas replied with bitter irony. "But Jake's brothers had money influence. They brought in a federal marshal who was on their payroll, bought testimony from witnesses who claimed I'd murdered Jake in cold blood. They painted me as a killer who'd lost his temper and gunned down an innocent man. The injustice of it made my heart ache for him. What happened then? My deputy was killed trying to protect me, shot in the back by one of the Finch brothers while I was in court. My fiancée fled town in the middle of the night after they threatened to do unspeakable things to her if she didn't leave. And I realized that staying to fight would just get more innocent people killed." He looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in my arms, oblivious to the violence that had touched his young life. "So I ran. Became a wanted man, a fugitive from the very law I'd sworn to uphold. And I've been running ever since." I reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble and the lines that years of guilt had etched there. "You're not running anymore," I said softly. "You're home." He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing, as if my words were a benediction he'd been waiting years to hear. "How can you say that knowing what I am, what I've done?" "I know what you are," I said with absolute conviction. "You're the man who gave me back my name and my dignity. You're the man who taught me to survive, to be strong, to love again. You're the father of my child and the keeper of my heart." I stepped closer until there was no space between us, until I could feel his breath on my face and see the hope beginning to kindle in his eyes. "The past is done, Silas. What matters is what we choose to do now, how we choose to live from this moment forward." Outside, the mountain wind sighed through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it rode the thermals high above our little valley. The bodies of Finch and Murphy would need to be dealt with, the evidence of violence cleaned away. There would be questions to answer and explanations to give if other lawmen came looking. But for now, in this moment, there was only the three of us, a family forged in hardship and tempered by love, standing together against whatever the future might bring. "I love you," Silas whispered the words, carrying the weight of redemption and hope, and the promise of new beginnings. Both of you, more than I ever thought possible. I love you too, I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. We're going to be all right, all of us together. Thomas chose that moment to wake fully his gray eyes, so like his father's opening to take in the world around him. He looked from Silas to me and back again, then smiled, that heartbreaking baby smile that could make everything else fade into insignificance. Silas reached out and gently stroked his son's cheek with one finger, his face soft with wonder and fierce protectiveness. I'll keep you both safe, he promised. Whatever it takes, however long I live, I'll keep you safe. And I believed him completely. This man who'd bought me in the snow and given me back my life, who'd faced down killers to protect his family, who'd chosen love over safety and hope over despair. He would keep his word. We were home,